Hello, welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories taking place not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyoung. President Yoon Suk-yeol delivered a New Year's message live from the presidential office on Sunday morning. Included in his 10-minute speech were outlines of the Yoon administration's goals as his term enters the second calendar year. Addressing economic challenges, Yoon said the country would tackle them by changing export strategy and underlined the need to carry out these major reforms: labor, education, and pensions. Why did President Yoon put an emphasis on these three reformative tasks, and what kind of leadership does he have to show to achieve what he calls difficult and tough goals? We bring you in-depth insight over the issue, and for that we have invited Professor Hong Sung-gul from Kookmin University on the line through Zoom. Hello, Professor Hong. Welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for inviting me here.
And we also have Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University on the line through Skype. Professor Cho, it is a pleasure to see you.
Good to see you again.
All right, first question, format. President Yoon delivered the New Year's message live from presidential office, but did not hold a press conference, which carries much weight as a chance for reporters to ask questions and get answers directly from the head of state. Professor Hong, what do you think of Yoon's live address but without a press conference?
Well, normally, usually, presidential New Year's speech is accompanied by, as you said, interviews with the correspondents. But this time, it was not actually implemented. Well, it is, I think, the kind of side effect that has been experienced by the president himself when he stopped the so-called doorstepping interviews. But the important thing is not whether the types of speech or interviews, but how to persuade the people and how to convey the genuine meaning and his enthusiasm to three different kinds of reforms to the general public.
Right, so it's important to how to persuade the public instead of the format. Now let's delve deeper into his speech then. Sometimes we can get to know the focal points of the speech through how often some of the key words were mentioned. Economy was mentioned 11 times, future 10 times, and reform 8. Now based on these keywords, Professor Cho, what were the main pillars that the Yoon administration is stressing, and what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I actually happened to catch the speech live as he was delivering it. And if they hadn't introduced it as the president's New Year address, I would have thought that it was a keynote speech or an opening remarks at an economic forum. As you said, he mentioned economy numerous times. And obviously, the focal point of this 10-minute address or speech was very much on the economy. And we can understand why, because we expect that 2023 is going to be a tough year because we are fighting against this high inflation, high interest rate, which is likely to climb even higher. We are facing deteriorating global trading conditions. And for an export-dependent nation like ours, it's going to be a very difficult time that we are going to have to go through. But I was a little bit struck by what wasn't mentioned in his New Year's address, because typically you'd expect that the president would set out, his vision for the whole year and not just focus on one particular aspect, even if that aspect is very important. So he didn't really mention much about national security. He didn't really mention anything about political cooperation. And I found it a little bit odd that he failed to make any reference at all to the Itaewon disaster where 158 people lost their lives. And so all in all, it was somewhat rather sort of withdrawn or a little bit disappointing New Year's address, personally.
Right. So mainly it was talking about the economy rather than other, national security issues and other societal issues. But there were also three major reforms President Yoon brought up, which was labor, education, and pensions. And among those, Yoon especially underlined the importance of labor reform. And while tapping into this issue, as we can see on the screen, Yoon kept mentioning those with vested interests, saying that there is no future for our country if it keeps turning a blind eye to those preoccupied with vested interests. Now, Professor Hong, who is he referring to?
Well, those three reforms you just talked about and President repeatedly emphasized were so much important that for the past 30 or more years, Korean society and the government, each and every government during the past 30 years, try to do something about these three areas, but nothing really major. Of course, there are some small progress have been made, but that no major progress have been made so far. So I think these three itself is a very big picture and a very burdensome kind of targets that he is just talk about. And then coming back to your question, there are many different vested interests groups in our society, especially in labor reform area. It is not just, normally people may think that it is about the labor organizations, especially the so-called Democratic Labor Organization in Korean 민주노총, but it's not just the 민주노총 itself, but I think all different kinds of vested rights or vested groups exist. Say, for instance, in the capitalist or the companies or the chaebols are also the vested. They have a vested interest and vested right, and also there are another type of labor is not really regular labor organizations, but there are many, labor people who are not involved in the regular labor unions. So we are talking about if is these and every group, if they just wanted to emphasize and they wanted to satisfy by themselves alone, then nothing could be made. So those vested interests means all different kinds of interests that we have to get out some kind of agreed conclusion for the reform. So that's my view.
Professor, then do you believe meaningful labor changes could be made if reforms are made over those with vested interests?
Well, it's very hard. I think it's very hard because, as I said, for 30 years, more than 30 years, no meaningful major progress have been made. But this is a kind of time that we have to really make some meaningful progress for the future. If we cannot make it, then the future generations and the economy itself will be in big trouble. And if we lost this time, it means that we lost our golden hours, golden time to save the country.
Right, so it would be important for us to save the golden time and push through such goals. Now, Professor Cho, President Yoon also stressed that the starting point for labor reform is establishing rule of law in labor relations. What is this rule of law, and in what ways is this administration trying to establish this?
The rule of law is most fundamental principle in a democratic society, meaning that everyone is subject to law, even the president. There is nobody who is above the law, and the law applies to everyone equally. I was struck by the fact that President specifically referred to labor relations, and not just labor relations, but he mentioned rule of law in labor and business. So between capital and labor, that they should be rule of law. But as I said, rule of law is a fundamental principle that should apply to everyone. So why is he mentioning this specifically? And I think this relates to the vested interest that he was referring to in his speech as well, because of course there are lots of different types of vested interest in labor relations and in the industry and society generally. But he was specifically referring to, I believe, labor unions and established interests within labor unions. And I think the truckers' strike that happened very recently was still fresh in his mind. And he was of firm belief that the strikes that they conducted was illegal. And he was really pinpointing to illegal activities by unions, and that these union members should be subject to law. But I should mention that the government, the way that Yoon administration was approaching that particular issue was really sort of trying to have their cake and eat it too, because they at once categorized those union members as employees and at the same time also referred to them as self-employed businesses. And so they are essentially self-contradictory. And the Yoon government seems to be very much focused on reforming the labor market, but they're not really, it seems like, concerned about how the businesses should be reformed or how the laws regarding the job market should be reformed to ensure better security, because just having flexibility in labor market is not the answer to everyone. It should be really like a pyramid where flexibility in labor market is supported by income security and also proper and reasonable policies regarding labor market, including retraining, upskilling, rescaling, all of those things. And if you look at successful countries that have reformed their labor market, they have those bases, whereas we seem to be just focused on flexibility alone, and that's not really going to lead to successful reform.
Right, the Professor Cho, but in addition to establishing the rule of law, the speech also included how companies need to make a transition to a duty-oriented, performance-based pay system. And though not directly mentioned in the speech, the Yoon administration is also aiming to add more flexibility, like you said, to the 52-hour workweek rule. What direction is the government trying to go, and do you think this is a proper way to go?
So regarding salary and how salary levels are determined, up until now, most companies have based that on seniority rather than how capable the employees are or how hard they're working or how successful they are in their jobs. So depending on how many years you've spent with the company, your pay would go up accordingly. But obviously, that's not really sustainable in this day and age, particularly where you're not really guaranteed job security for a lifetime, and you are going to move, and change jobs numerous times throughout your career. So linking pay to your performance obviously makes sense and is reasonable. But it should also be linked to proper management of other benefits and also improving quality of work. And you mentioned about the working hours, and we still have by law 52-hour week, whereas most developed nations have on average 40-hour standard week. Some of the countries are now moving to 4-day week. France, for example, has a 35-hour week. And so I feel that although Yoon administration claims that this is to introduce flexibility and people can essentially work really hard for 6 months of the year and then maybe take 3 months off at a time, but it doesn't really work like that in reality, as we all know. They are sort of talking about changing laws to increase weekly hours up to 69 hours per week, and that's really going to contribute to illnesses, injuries, possibly to death by overwork. All of those things that we have actually seen in practice, and so those are things that they should really sort of be approached with more caution. And I don't feel that they have really done enough thought through sort of consideration on the topic.
Right. So until now, we talked about labor reform, but we had to move forward to the education. The focus was on higher education, right? President Yoon said the government will boldly transfer relevant authority to local governments and link education to specific industries there. What hurdles is higher education facing, Professor Hong, and what kind of authority is the central government trying to hand over?
Okay, that higher education moves on to the local government or locality is actually connected with the disappearance of the local area nowadays. And also for the higher education in Korean society, there is so far the central governments, especially the Ministry of Education, have very strong grip on all these kind of private universities and colleges. As people know well, about 70% of higher education in Korea is being provided by the private universities and colleges. And those private universities and colleges were under strong control of the central government, that is the Ministry of Education, and therefore the creativity and the variety of different schools and different institutions have been kind of disappeared so far. So I think the direction that the Yoon government is talking about toward the educational reform means kind of revitalize the differences and varieties of higher education, especially linking to the development of the local autonomy and the local development. And now is in big crisis in Korean society.
Right. So the goal was to extend the diversities in higher education. Now, Professor Hong, the last reform, it was President Yoon, what he talked about was pensions. It seems every administration in history has tried to tackle the pension issue, but there has not been any meaningful changes since 1998 when the premium rate was pushed up to 9%. Now, first, what pension issue is South Korea facing, and why was it so difficult for administrations in the past to overhaul this system?
Well, this issue is also connected to the vested interests. Those beneficiaries from the pension system do not want to lose their benefits, right? But the Korean pension system is at the beginning in the 1970s designed to invite more kind of pension payers, which and therefore the benefits out of pension system is much higher than the contribution. And so, from this kind of aging society now, if this goes on, then our future generation will not get any kind of pensions out of this kind of pension system. In short, the current pension system is not sustainable at all. And therefore, all the vested interests, in other words, those who paid so far, they contributed so far, small contribution with a large benefit, have to be curtailed into medium contribution and medium benefits. So you said that we are now the pension is about 9%. In average industrial societies, those average pension contribution is about 16% of their income. So I think we should make some kind of agreement, reach agreement to reform this whole pension system by curtail the vested interest in somewhat to make a kind of even point for the future generations.
Right. Until now, we have talked about what was included in the speech. But moving on to what he did not mention during his speech, he did not have any message on North Korea's increasing threats, nor he did not have any, political cohesion with opposition bloc, right? What do you think is the reason behind this, and what are your thoughts on this, Professor Cho?
I think these were topics that the president wasn't really prepared to speak very much. And I believe that he didn't really want to start the year on the wrong foot by saying too much or saying the wrong things. The current political situation is such that it's very difficult to expect real kind of cooperation. The leader of the opposition party is being investigated on numerous fronts. And regarding national security, we've had the debacle over North Korean drones just recently. We also know that North Korea is preparing, most likely, to carry out the 7th nuclear tests. So things are pretty dire on both of those fronts. And so it's probably just human nature to avoid these kind of difficult, thorny subjects in his very first address in this new year.
All right, unfortunately, this is all time we have for today's edition. Well, thank you, Professor Hong, for your insights, and thank you, Professor Cho. It was a pleasure to have you with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Now, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Have a great rest of the evening, and we will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories on the issues happening in South Korea and, of course, around the globe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.